Good morning, everyone.
I got my book already.
Not too. Morning, Johnny.
Good morning. You had a fatality on 66 this morning.
I know, I heard. I had to shut it down.
We're going to resume the workshop portion of our meeting. I know that yesterday was a very tough day. I know in North Carolina and Virginia, and I was going to ask our Deputy Commissioner, Rob Carey, just to give us an update on how things are regarding Florence.
Madam Secretary, members of the board, yesterday was we started out hopeful that we would get by better than we did, and unfortunately yesterday we had 2 deaths in Virginia. We had a tornado victim in Chesterfield County, and we had last night in Louisa County a car in a flash flood, a victim in a car drowned. So very unfortunate. So we unfortunately, I think you can say, added 2 people to those totals for the storm. We were fortunate yesterday in one regard with one of our facilities. The Chesterfield residency was impacted by a tornado, trees down. The res engineer's car, or Ford Explorer, was crushed. Some of you may have seen that picture of a big tree across his car. Trees on buildings there, but they did not actually penetrate the roofs or anything. So I think we're in okay shape there. But that was literally within a mile or so of the location where the person was killed by the tornado. I can't say exactly how many tornadoes there were. It may have been one that touched down multiple times, or a number of different tornadoes, but I've seen reports of up to 12 different spots where it may have hit. This morning we have 259 roads closed, 59 in Richmond District, 61 in Stanton, 40 in Lynchburg, 34 in Culpeper, 34 in Salem, and 18 in Bristol, and the other districts less than that. They're quickly opening those up as fast as they can, but obviously with power lines entangled in the trees and so forth, they can only go as fast as the power companies are able to support that. And of course, the power companies are dealing with some stuff in North Carolina as well. We also this morning, just separate from the storm, we had a major crash with a fatality on 66 in Northern Virginia that was blocking most of that roadway for a good section of the morning, so it had backups up to 14 miles. I would also say that last night, and I'm sure the Secretary may talk about this, we were asked to supply some assistance to North Carolina by their Secretary of Transportation. We're working on that today to help out down there. So that's where we stand. As I said, unfortunately, we were hoping yesterday we wouldn't see any of those pop-up tornadoes or flooding, and we ended up seeing it in 2 places. So a storm like that's always unpredictable, but that's where we stand today. If y'all have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
I will just, our thoughts are also with our colleagues over in Richmond at the residency, and, Patrick Henry in the Capitol, who actually spent a very long time in stairwells yesterday. So thank you for that update. It is true that last evening, US DOT actually reached out on behalf of the Secretary of Transportation, Jim Drogden, in North Carolina, that they are having a huge issue with communications and getting communications out. So Marshall Herman is on her way. She's being driven back to figure out how to get down to Raleigh, and I think we'll be offering some further assistance in that arena. It turns out that communications is one of the biggest issues, trying to reach people during this time. So as we learn, we'll let you all know as well. So unless there are any thoughts or questions. Okay, with that, I thought after the commissioner's presentation, specifically dealing with Route 7 yesterday, that before we got into questions, it might be helpful for Nick to do his presentation on policy recommendations, and then kind of do a combined session for Q&A afterwards.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the board, Nick Donahue, Deputy Secretary of Transportation. As you all may recall, when we met in Alexandria and discussed the Route 7 issue and you all voted on that, there was a request by the board that staff come back and develop a draft policy for your consideration at this meeting on how these instances would be handled in the future. And so working with the commissioner, we've developed a 4 different recommendations that we'd like to discuss with you all this morning, get your feedback on, and bring a revised resolution for your consideration in our October meeting. There's, as I've noted, 4 different pieces. The first is that upfront in the smart scale process, prior to the release of scores, VDOT would conduct additional reviews of certain types of projects. First, any project that cost over $50 million would have the district review, as every project does today, but then would also undergo a more thorough and rigorous examination at the central office level with a different set of eyes just to review those types of estimates. And I think it was noted yesterday, being off 20% on a $5 million project is not good, but it's $1 million. Being off 20% on a $100 million project is very bad, and it's $20 million. And so again, any of these larger scale projects would automatically undergo this additional review, again, before scores are even released, so that we can modify the estimates as necessary. In addition to that, VDOT would work through internal policies to establish kind of certain thresholds in general for project types based on their size, scale, and other factors. And any project that looks like it kind of falls out of that, either higher or lower, would be subject to an additional review. And again, prior to the scores, and estimates would be updated or revised as necessary at the outset of this process, and again, prior to any release of scores. And so that's something that we are recommending be put in place at the very beginning as we do the other validation of projects that goes through today, where we look at project readiness and other things of that nature. Secondly, we're recommending that after projects are selected, VDOT report quarterly on whether there have been any changes to the projects that have been selected in any round of smart scale that increase dramatically the risk of that project and the risk of meeting the estimate that was used for the basis of allocating funds to that project. And again, the very discrete example that should be fresh in your mind is Washington Gas is now undertaking this very, very large project in close proximity to ours, which creates risk for our project, risk for the contractor, risk for interaction and other difficulties of that nature. So VDOT would again develop internal policies outlining the types of risks they would look for and would report to you all quarterly on that. And again, there may be instances where there's nothing to report, but I suspect there will be many instances where there is something to report, where risks have developed since those projects were selected, but prior to them really going out to bid, so that we have that information in advance before it goes out, and we're not in a situation where this bubbles up at the receipt of bids. The last 2 items are what happens if those 2 safeguards don't catch the problem and don't resolve the issue. And so the project comes in, it exceeds the existing smart scale policy for things that can be handled administratively and requires to come back to the board because the overage is over the percentages that were established. And again, that generally means it's more than $1 million off. In those instances, projects need to come back to the board in most cases. What we are recommending then is that when you all are notified that a project is over, before you are ever asked to consider what action you may wish to take on that, the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment will provide several things to the board. The first is a revised smart scale score. So what would that project have scored in the round of smart scale it was selected in if it had had that higher cost at that time? We will also provide a list of projects that were funded in that round that scored lower than this revised smart scale score, if any. And then we will also rerun the funding scenario to tell you what would have happened if in that round of smart scale if we had known that higher cost up front, so that you can see what the impacts were of this project being selected with a cost estimate that ended up being incorrect as we move forward. And we would give you a list of any projects that would be impacted that were funded or that were not selected for funding but could have been had we known that higher cost in advance. And again, you would be given that information when you were made aware of the fact that the bids came in over, so well in advance of you all considering whether you wish to pull the plug on the project or to allocate district grant money or high priority projects money to that project. And finally, we would also tell you how much district grant money is available and unallocated in that district, and how much high priority projects money is available and unallocated statewide. So you could have that information again at least a month in advance to consider your options before we come back and ask you for action on that project and determine what its fate may be. And then the final item is, again, when that instance is triggered and a project comes in over bid, is that VDOT will produce an after-action report going through the project as the commissioner did yesterday, looking at where the estimates were accurate, where they were not quite as accurate, and other things that we believe led to this instance, and as, if appropriate or necessary, develop any policies to try and address those situations moving forward in the future to reduce such frequencies.
One question, is not quite as accurate is the same thing as inaccurate?
A matter of style.
Madam Chair? Having kind of lived through this, I appreciate all the work and the thinking. The one thing that I would suggest maybe you add to your list, Nick, related to the information that comes to the CTB, that, you know, okay, we really have a serious problem, here's how much money is left. I think the last piece that we need in that is also how many other at-risk things are hanging out there that we need to consider. So we have a sense of what the whole risk pool in the next, say, 12 to 18 months might be.
No, and I think the quarterly report will give us that information, but I think we can make sure that's compiled and given to you when you're considering the fate of a particular project.
Commissioner, haven't you started that process?
What I'd say is yes, as I said yesterday, we do have 43 projects on what I'll call the at-risk projects, and those are certainly all of the projects that we've looked at to date, whether they're in the scoping phase or they're at other milestones in the project phase. I'd say that we're well on the way. Many of the items the Deputy Secretary talked about are those controls that we've already started putting into place. They'll be refined as the process goes along. We are approaching some of those milestones that was said that we're going to need to be in a position that we're going to need to make some very hard decisions as to whether the project moves forward into the next phase or the milestone, probably at the next meeting. So we'll certainly get that information out well in advance of the next meeting so that we could have a very good dialogue on the particular projects that are at risk.
Next question.
Yesterday, you mentioned in the Route 7 presentation that we had been sort of given a risk assessment last year by the VDOT commissioner. When you give your risk assessments, how can we more accurately be aware of the crisis ahead? I mean, I don't recall. I looked in my notes. I looked at the meetings. I don't recall the details of how we were notified during that presentation. Is there? You need a sledgehammer? You need something to sort of wake us up?
I mean,
I guess it's a matter of style, but
I think at the October board meeting, I think this is going to be one of those times that we're going to need to feel our way through. Many of these projects that I feel that are at risk are at the very early stages of the project development phase. Route 7, in my opinion, was much further along. We were already heading down the design build path. We had a design in place. We knew a fairly accurate cost estimate at that point in time. These projects that you're going to see and experience are in the pre-scoping or the scoping phase, and as I said, don't have a lot of engineering associated with it, so we're going to have to watch them migrate through every step of the way through the development process leading up to the bid. I think you're going to see in some of these projects that I bring before you in October, there are some projects that, and I'll give an example, there's one in the city of Suffolk right now that has a right-of-way cost that jumped $7 million. That is a project that is probably going to be at risk, and that will be, truthfully, a sledgehammer, to use your term, that we're going to need to deal with. There are other ones that are subtle examples that we are $300,000–400,000 over. They do trigger the smart scale reevaluation. Is that an opportunity then for the locality to be able to put additional money onto that project to be able to make it, let it advance through the process? But this is going to be an ongoing effort on a quarterly basis, and if we need to do it more frequently, we'll certainly do it more frequently to bring it back to the board so that you are aware as we go through this that those estimates are changing.
But Mr. Connors, I would also add, I think what happened with Route 7 has happened in the past. What is different this time is we now have smart scale. We have distinct rounds of funding. Projects are held much more tightly to their budgets. And in the past, because of the way we allocated funds and the liquidity in the program, if you'll call it, with so many partially funded projects where if a project ran over, you could, oh, well, we'll just take the PE funding from this project in year 6 because, well, it's just PE. It doesn't even have construction. It's 6 years away. Who knows what that is? And I think we talked a lot over the last several years about Smart Scale does a lot with the board on how you all pick projects. But on the flip side, it also does a ton to the department now where every project has a discrete budget. When things go over now, the first thing is not where do I find money, it's how do I change the project to still get the same benefits for less cost. That's a paradigm shift in the department. And so I think Route 7s have happened in the past. The way we program, though, has changed so dramatically that the impacts of a Route 7 happening today are much more, they're felt a lot more by the board. And so I think we've all learned from the Route 7 experience. I think these new policies are going to give us the visibility, and we've all seen the issues, I'll call it, that are created when a Route 7 happens under this new programming paradigm that we have in place. And so I think moving forward, as long as this information is provided, we've now gone through that experience. It was the first time we'd really gone through it under a smart scale, and I think we now all have a much greater understanding and respect for the implications.
And Mr. Connors, I will just say that once we were made aware of this, we immediately informed the board at the next meeting that there was an issue. And then having to delve through this so that we're presenting accurate information. When we learned it, that of course also alerted us to the fact that there could be others out there. So we're working through the process as well. And I thought perhaps I'd just ask Mr. Whitworth and Mr. Malbin, because of giving input to Nick and developing this policy, what your thoughts might be.
Well, my concerns that I expressed last month were twofold. One, of course, we need to make sure that the board is involved at the front end of a problem and that there's very clear transparency. And the other is that we not let the Route 7 decision be a guideline for future decisions. We weren't setting a precedent. So they were the two things that were on my plate. The one thing that I wanted to make sure that we know is during the continuum of a project, more and more money is spent. And at any given time, to pull the plug, there is a loss of some amount of money. And we need to know, one, the loss of pulling the plug versus the amount of money to make the project go forward. I think that's a very key point in making a good decision.
We can add that, I think, both to the quarterly report to say what has been spent to date, and if, again, the early safeguards fail us and we do receive a bid that's over, when we come back to you kind of saying, do you want to pull the plug in this project or fund it, we can tell you how much has been spent up to date at that point, because you are right.
And what would be lost.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
To that point, what I'd say is that quarterly document that I'll provide in October is already doing that, because there is that repayment that if we go down this path and we start paying or start expending preliminary engineering money, there is a repayment. If we get into the right-of-way phase, there's going to be a repayment. So having that knowledge of how far do we go before we make this decision is going to be a key.
I think the policy changes significantly address my concerns. Smart Scale makes it a different process now. If you remember, before Smart Scales, we used to put money on projects like we put right-of-way on money, we put utilities on, put engineering on. So we were tinkering with the project, and over the period of allocating that money and getting the information as a result of that, gave us a better idea of what the final costs were. And obviously, our initial estimate, we were impacted as we moved through that process. Smart Scale makes it totally different now, because when we elect that project, we put money on it to the completion, and it puts more of a responsibility on us to be much more diligent in the estimating, and as a result, more transparency that when we find these irregularities that we're communicated to, and as a board, we're able to adjust and either fund it or make other recommendations.
Madam Secretary. I agree with John's comments. We can't hide these things anymore as we used to, so this is great that we're having this dialogue. But Steve, I had a specific question on some of the comments you made yesterday, and this, to Nick's point, you know, I think we've figured out what's happened in the past, and the question is how we avoid these issues in the future. And yesterday, in describing what happened with Route 7, you pretty much characterized what I call the estimator's dilemma, and that is, how do you deal with uncertain information? And I guess one of the takeaways I got from that is that we're going to continue to have a high degree of uncertainty in the projects that come through Smart Scale because of the early phase that we're estimating. And the only offset to uncertainty, I guess in my view, is sophisticated contingency development. And so I guess my question really is, when we put together a proposal like Route 7, an cost estimate like Route 7 going forward, how sophisticated is our contingency analysis on a line item basis to offset some of the things that you've described? I guess my past experience is that the more you break that down and refine it, and then talk about the range of variability in each of those categories. For instance, we've estimated utilities at X. The worst case scenario is it could be Y. The probability of that is 30%. I mean, very sophisticated contingency models can be built. What is our process there, and is that an independent process from the cost estimating?
I think we're very early in on the process, but what I'm coming into this right now is from the Smart Scale scope development process, we're identifying what the key elements of the project are and the risks that are associated with it. If it's environmental risk, our location design staff and our district staff are working together to be able to help identify what we think would be an appropriate contingency attached to that particular risk item. Technology may be another key component. It's going to be an evolutionary type approach because we are building those budgets and estimates at very early stage, and we're going to have to migrate through it. The right-of-way risk assessment, we're going to need to take a look at what the market is doing at that point in time, and a little bit of a crystal ball to figure out what that's going to be in 4 to 5 years or 6 years out. That's why I'm saying that for us being able to put this on the table today on a quarterly basis, it's going to be evolutionary. We don't have that crystal ball right now.
You never will, I guess, is my point. But I guess my question is more one of process and what we're currently doing, what we might want to do. Do we have a uniform contingency analysis guideline that every district uses in preparation of their bid or their cost estimates? Are we all using the same model and applying the same metrics to those models?
Trying to apply the same model right now, but I think there's an opportunity to evolve that model based upon the specific project that's at hand. It's going to have to get more robust. That's one of the items that we're looking at right now, is working with a consultant to be able to identify major market shifts and predict what those market shifts may be, to be able to accommodate that as risk items back into the estimate development. And that's, the discussions have just started.
And I know that your estimating is very transparent. Is there, or I guess I'll ask, should there be a separate document that identifies what the contingency analysis was and how it was calculated? I just, in the context of what you said yesterday, those variables are not going to change. We're going to have right-of-way risk, we're going to have utility risk, we're going to have timing risk, we're going to have steel tariff risk. I think we would benefit perhaps from, when we look at an estimate, identifying what constitutes the 10 or 15 or 20% or 30% in some cases contingencies that you've applied to that contract.
Something that I'll bring back to the board and give a report back to what that might look like and where we're going to go with cost estimating then.
Madam Secretary, getting back, Smart Scale is forcing us to look at our processes and adapt and change to reflect the issues we had in Route 7. I'm going back prior to Smart Scale, when we used to incrementally put money on a project. Sometimes, getting to Dixon's point, there's a lot of money that was spent that was